everyone, Clio here, and today I wanted to go through my wish list. So I don't have an official Amazon wish list or anything like that, but I do keep a list of like books that I'm interested in acquiring, books that are like top notch. I want these books at some point. I am somewhat on a book buying ban, so cannot give you a haul or anything like that. In any case, I don't necessarily support, for my channel at least, the creation of haul videos. I usually have my haul sections in my wrap-ups, and so, but I thought this could be an interesting one to add as a sort of alternative to the haul video, the wish list video. So currently on my wish list, let's go through the books. So first up on that list is a book that is definitely on almost everybody's radars at this moment, and that is The Invisible Life of Adidas by V.E. Schwab. So this is a book that is coming out in September. I sadly did not get did not qualify for the ARC via NetGalley or anything like that. I am definitely interested in it. I will say I am less interested than most people, I guess, because I still haven't read any V.E. Schwab. I do have a darker shade of magic on my shelves, but yeah, you know, I am getting caught up in the hype a little bit. I am also quite intrigued because I hear a lot of people saying that it's like not a typical V.E. Schwab book, and so that people who typically love V.E. Schwab might be disappointed, and that just automatically intrigues me, because a lot of times things that a lot of people find disappointing, I actually am very intrigued about and think that might work for me. As far as I'm aware, it's a book in which we are looking at a sort of pact with the devil, which is a concept that I very much like. It's something that, you know, kind of makes me think back to Supernatural, where you had these sort of crossroads demons, and so I'm very interested to see what we're gonna get. Lala from Books with Lala definitely very much loved this book, and she also has a tendency, like I have a tendency to like the books that she likes, so very interested in that one. Next up, the second one on my wish list, I will say, is there for the name, but I don't remember too much about its premise. I know that I looked into it and that I actually did consider that premise to be quite interesting, and that is Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. This is a book coming out in October, I think, maybe November, which has a magic school setting. That's really about everything that I know about it. I will say that I personally am not that interested in Naomi Novik's other fantasy books, because they seem to be relatively romance-centered, but I do believe that when at least based on the premise of A Deadly Education, it definitely didn't seem like it was like going to be romance-heavy, and definitely gave me a little bit more of like dark academia vibes. Next up is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which is a book that I don't know the premise about, but it's somewhat vague in my mind at least. Midnight Library is basically sort of like Twilight Zone. It's like in between life and death, and our main character goes to this midnight library, and through the book she's kind of exploring alternative possibilities for the choices she made in life, I think, but she's making some choices now that might endanger the library. In any case, it's a magical library setting, and I just love that in itself, but also just, you know, meta levels of having books centered around books, so very much intrigued by that one. Next up is Love in Color by Bolu Babalola. This is a myth retelling, but I think it's like a collection of different myth retellings which are coming from all around the world, and which I'm going to assume are centered around love. I love mythology in general, but I have had a lot more exposure to like Greek, Roman mythology, to Egyptian mythology than I did to any sort of other mythology. Even within European tradition, Norse mythology, for example, is a mythology that I haven't been exposed to quite a lot, but it has always intrigued me, and so the stories or the myths that I've been exposed to from other places in the world definitely also hugely intrigued me. And so after taking like the part in the Mythtake readathon, I really made the intention for myself to try and dive back into mythology a little bit more, and so I think that this book would be perfect for that, to get some sort of samplings of mythology from very different cultures, and obviously it's also going to be very great for representation's sakes of having different voices, different stories, and different looks at like the big issues, because myths are always about like these big questions that we have in life, so it's going to be very interesting to see how different cultures have tackled these. Next up is Blue Tickets by Sophie McIntosh. This seems to be a sort of like dystopian thriller book in which basically basically your choice of whether you're allowed to get a child depends on a lottery system. So I did already see it referred to as like the next great dystopian classic, but obviously that's just marketing, so I don't know how true that is going to be, but in any case that premise does seem interesting to me. Also in like, not just in the sense of having people with a wish for children not being allowed to have children because they don't win the lottery, but also like my question would be going into that premise, are you allowed to submit yourself for this lottery? Like if you don't want children, can you choose not to have any or anything like that? So it's an interesting concept and I'm very much looking forward to diving into that book as well. Next up, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. So this is not a recent release or anything like that. I think it even came out in 2019, and that is then of course the English translation, because it was probably out in Japan way before that, not entirely sure when it came out there. But so I read The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa this year, absolutely loved it, and The Housekeeper and the Professor already talks a little bit about memory, and so that is also what The Memory Police is obviously going to be about. So The Memory Police is about a world in which things are disappearing, but they're not really disappearing, but they're disappearing from people's collective memory. That's the concept. I don't know more about the particulars. So it's an interesting concept, and I actually have another book that is also apparently about that subject, because I watched a video by Emma from Drinking by My Shelf in which she talked about that, and that is When Cats Disappear from the World, which is also a Japanese novel, and thinking about it now I should actually add that to this list as well. Next up is Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce. So Miss Benson's Beetle is basically about an expedition to go and find a certain beetle. Sounds boring? Perhaps. I love expedition stories, so I don't think that I'm going to find that boring in itself, but it's also going to be apparently looking a lot at this sort of beautiful friendship between women, and I love friendship stories. I think we have way too little friendship stories, so I absolutely want to have more of them. Also, Rachel Joyce she has moved me with every single one of her books, and Perfect, for example, was like the perfect blend between heartbreaking, heartwarming, something I absolutely love finding in literature, so I will definitely want to dive into her latest release as well. Next up is Difficult Women by Helen Lewis. I forgot the subtitle, but it's something like A History of Feminism in 10 Fights, I think. The number might be different. But so, as you can imagine from that subtitle, it's going to be looking at the history of feminism and at some like key points within that history, some like moments that really gave like a surge within our rights as females, our freedoms as females. And so I've been wanting to dive into a little bit more of like non-fiction surrounding feminism, surrounding racism, surrounding ableism. So this is just another logical title to go for with that in mind. Next up, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is a book that I don't actually know why I'm interested in it, but it's a book all about fungi. I know, it's a non-fiction book. So it's called Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures. So I guess in part that sort of subtitle really drew me in, because it seems to like indicate that there's a whole lot more to fungi than what we believe. I also know that fungi have a very important role to play within like the endangerment of our climate at the moment. You know, I think that it's the American oak, I think, maybe it's another tree that's hugely being threatened by fungi at the moment. So I do hope that this book, for example, is going to look into that. But it's also just a system that I know nothing about and that I want to learn more about. Yeah, I don't know particularly why this book draws me in. I guess it just also has a very beautiful cover to go with that interesting subject. But I do definitely want to at the very least explore this book and find out whether it is something for me or not. Next up we go to Jade City by Fonda Lee, I think. Yes, it is by Fonda Lee. So Jade City is the first book in the Green Bone saga, and it is a book about, as far as I'm aware, it's like two warring jade trader families. So it's going to be, I'm going to assume it's going to be somewhat like a mafia story, which has like two strong families invested in the jade trade, which is obviously also has a lot of like illegal activity going on with it, at least in reality. And so I'm expecting some like badass mafia scenes while also having these super strong and tight family connections, but also the possibility of people wanting to step outside of that family and having like problems exploring that possibility because they will be betraying the family in that sense. So it says indeed, Jade City is a gripping Godfather-esque saga of intergenerational blood feuds, vicious politics, magic and kung fu. Hadn't thought about the kung fu possibility. Indeed, obviously it's, yeah, basically if you hadn't realized at this point, it is going to be like Chinese inspired, Asian inspired fantasy, which I absolutely love. And yeah, I cannot wait to see what it's going to do with that, especially because, you know, I was a little bit hesitant going into this because I hadn't, like, I heard about this book a couple of months ago, but at that point I hadn't heard almost anybody talk about it. So I was a little bit hesitant, you know, it was on my will at some point read this book pile, but now everybody seems to have finally discovered this book. Everybody's reading it and everybody's loving it, and really people that I highly respect, whose opinion I highly respect, are very much falling in love with this book, calling it a great new fantasy series, one of the like top-notch fantasies. So I definitely want to explore it myself as well. And so apparently also the jade that is involved within this is magical jade. Now it can grant certain abilities, but I don't know more about that. But so obviously, of course, there was going to be some magical element to it because it's a fantasy. But honestly, that's not even what's intriguing, what's pushing me into this series. I'm honestly just so much down for the sort of like mafia Godfather type of possible elements to this story. Next up, let's check out The Tree Body Problem by Cixin Liu. Oh, I've heard this pronounced so often in its American version that I just no longer can pronounce Chinese apparently. Cixin Liu. I don't know the tones, so I'm just imagining certain tones on it, but that could have been totally wrong. But so, Tree Body Problem. It is a sci-fi. It is supposed to be heavy sci-fi, heavy on the science parts of things. It's supposed to be probably also somewhat problematic in terms of its depiction of women, but everybody loves this book. Everybody says it's amazing. I don't know what it's about, but I actually don't care what it's about. I want to read it, make up my own mind, and see whether I want to continue with the series or not after that. Next up is Afropean Notes from Black Europe by loading Johnny Pitts. It's going to be heavily focusing, I'm assuming, on the way in which black people have been treated within Europe, the way that they have had to fight for freedoms, for advancements, for their position within this world. And so I've started, I read a non-fiction about racism in America recently, but I definitely want to be looking at a more European perspective, just because that is the reality in which I live. So I definitely want to be aware of what black people around me are dealing with, and I'm definitely sure that there are huge similarities with the way that black peoples are treated in America, but there will be differences, I'm sure of it. There will always be difference between one reality and another, and so I'm interested to see, you know, what comes out of this book. Next up is Those Above by Daniel Polanski. So I recently read The Seventh Perfection by Daniel Polanski, which is a book coming out end of September, but I've also seen a date in November fly around, so I'm not entirely sure now about when it's getting released. But so I absolutely loved that book, so I definitely want to read more by him. And Those Above is the first book in a duology that he has written. And so in Those Above we are looking at a society that is kind of ruled by these godlike figures who are called Those Above. And like 10 years or something in the past of this world, there was a huge revolt by the humans to try and overthrow these, but they were heavily beaten down. But now like rumors of a new revolt are starting to rise. Basically, that doesn't necessarily sound different than a whole lot of other premises for fantasy novels, but because I absolutely loved The Seventh Perfection, I'm so interested to see what he will do with this. Whether he will also have a sort of like interesting structural style or narrative style used in this one, or in any case whether I also love his more like traditional prose if he has that. So yeah, I just want to dive into more Daniel Polanski's. Next up, a book I already read, but there's a specific edition coming out or already out that I absolutely want, and that is the children edition of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. So I'll have the beautiful edition up here. I love children classics editions. I think they're beautiful. I have not yet bought any of them, but I do want to buy this one. So Christmas Carol is one of my favorite stories by Dickens, and it's definitely one that I would recommend to people because a lot of people don't necessarily vibe all that well with Charles Dickens, and I think they will still love a Christmas Carol. So yeah, Charles Dickens was paid by the word, so his novels do tend to get quite lengthy, and so there are definitely like a lot of things that you could kick out of a story and still have that same essence to it. And so his Christmas Carol is obviously, it's a novella, so it reduces that to its bare minimum, and it's a great story in and of itself. I don't know whether this edition of the Christmas Carol will also include some of his other Christmas books, because I also definitely love The Cricket and the Heart, but I'm not sure whether it's going to be included. But in any case, that is an extra recommendation for you guys should you want to try one of his other novellas. The Cricket and the Heart is also a Christmas story, and it is also a beautiful one. Next up is the Nakano Thrift Shop by Hiromi Kawakami. So I stumbled upon these editions a while back and I absolutely love them. So the Nakano Thrift Shop takes place within a thrift shop, and it's about two employees, well, one employee having a crush on another one. It seems to be a sort of like lovely, quiet, understated Japanese novel, the way I absolutely love my Japanese novels. And but like I also love the element of having this sort of like quiet, this sort of like charming thrift shop in which this all takes place, and the possibility of having like the stories of customers involved within this story. I've heard great things about this one, and so I definitely also want to try out his writing. It was also her works were also recommended by Kate on her channel, Kate Feel, and you know, she reads a lot of Japanese literature, and I read a lot of Japanese literature, so I definitely want to read more, so I definitely want to give this author a go as well. Next up we have Piranesi, I don't know how you would say that in English. I'm just going to say it in the way that I think I need to pronounce it, because that's the way I want to pronounce this, and that's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I don't actually know too much about. It's just the next book by Susanna Clarke. So I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell when I was like in high school, so probably age like 17 or something when I read this book, and I hated it at first. It is like 900 pages long, I guess, and the first 600 were really a total nightmare. I just had to drag myself through it. I couldn't do it. I wanted to put it down, but I was on a holiday with a friend of mine, and so she didn't bring a book along, and so she borrowed this book first and she read it first. And she told me that it was amazing, that I had to continue, that I was going to thank her for it, and those final 300 pages were amazing. They were so good. I really loved those 300 pages. Some of the best 300 pages I've read in a book. So I'm very interested to see what will happen in this new book by Susanna Clarke. Will it be more like those first 600 pages that I absolutely hated, or will she have found a way to get those 300 pages into a book on itself. I am actually not going to dive into more details about this book because I like to go into certain books without knowing too much about them, and I have this feeling about this book that I don't want to explore it too much. So that's all the information that I'm going to be looking for it. All I need is the author's name. Next up we have This Winter by Alice Oseman. So I recently read Loveless by Alice Oseman and I absolutely loved it. You know, it was like 4.5 for me. It was like just that little bit missing from it. But I want to dive into more by Alice Oseman, and I love winter stories, I love Christmas stories. I don't have enough Christmas stories because while I do like Christmas stories, a lot of them tend to be like the Hallmark movie type, and I want them to be a little bit different than that. So I don't know whether this will fit that bill or not, because there's definitely the potential, I think, with Alice Oseman to go in that sort of like Hallmark movie type of plot line in any case. I think it features characters from one of her other books. I don't know whether it's from Heartstopper or whether it's from Radio Silence or Solitaire, but in any case I won't have read any of those other ones, but I'm going to assume that I can like it without that. And then the final book that I am mentioning here is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. So in The Vanishing Half we are following two sisters who are, I think they might even be twin sisters, but they are like very light-skinned black girls, and they could go as white passing. And this book is kind of going to be looking at the different choices they make. So one of the sisters marries a very dark-skinned guy, and the other sister marries a white guy and pretends to be white herself. So it's definitely going to be looking at colorism, it's going to be looking at racism, and it's going to be very interesting to look at not only the way in which these different choices will impact their life and their opportunities and the opportunities for their children, but also in the way in which they will look back on these choices, you know. For example, the sister who will be white passing, will she come to regret these decisions because she will have to live with this sort of secret? She will have to kind of reject her heritage, reject the way that she has been raised, reject the people who have been a very big part of her life, I guess. And like, it will also be interesting to see, like, was this really a conscious choice, or is this something that she stumbled into, like sort of like situation where people just assumed her to be white and she just never corrected them? Or like, there's a lot about this book that I find intriguing, and so many people are reading it at the moment, so many people are loving it. It's another one of those cases where when I first heard about this book months ago, I was very intrigued, but it just didn't have like the top priority, just because I have so many books that I still need to read that are on my shelves already, and now I'm just like feeling like I need to catch up to this book because so many people are reading and loving it. So I guess that just means that I need to get quicker with my reading, but once that I've reduced the amount of unread books on these shelves, I can actually start doing that. So yeah, this is my current list of like books that are on my radar, books that I want to purchase, books that I want to read, definitely. I am a little bit on a book buying ban at the moment, so I won't be purchasing these anytime soon. There are books missing from this list that are, for example, pre-ordered, so I already have these. These are on my radar and I will be buying some, so I didn't include those. But I think in December I'm definitely going to be taking stock of what's on these shelves again. I have a goal for where I want to be in terms of the amount of unread books on this shelf by the end of this year, and I will also do an unhaul. So if I manage to get under that number in that unhaul, I can purchase books until I get to that number again. So yeah, hopefully that will be the case, and hopefully I can buy a lot of books in December, because there's just so many out there that I want to read at the moment. But so yeah, let me know down below if there are any books that you feel like I should be buying, that I need to prioritize out of that list that I gave, and like, what's one of the books that you absolutely have on your radar right now that you're just either dying for it to come out or waiting for you to have the money or the space on your bookshelves to purchase. So yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!